Welcome to episode 16 of the Football Conversations. Joining me on this episode was author David Snowdon to discuss Sunderland Football Club's struggles in the mid to late 1970s, as well as a wider conversation about English football in general during this period. David, welcome aboard and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Always good to be able to regress back to the late 70s.
No problem at all. Preceding the period covered by your fantastic book, A Fistful of Doldrums, was the reign of Bob Stokoe at Sunderland. Just how big a figure was Stokoe at Roker Park?
Well, very big. The term legendary is overused, but when he came in the autumn of 72, Sunderland were in a very low ebb. Alan Brown had just left the club in very near the bottom of Division 2. Stokoe came in, had quite a bit of lower league experience, management experience with the likes of Bury. He was a former Newcastle player, but although I was very young at the time, I don't think there was that intense time where rivalry. I'm not saying it wasn't there, but there wasn't this stigma about a player or a staff management going directly from between Newcastle and Sunderland or Sunderland and Newcastle. So I don't think there was any animosity for Stoker coming in. Or I have read one or two isolated remarks when he didn't hit the ground running. There were one or two things said from a minority of the crowd. But then obviously the FA Cup traditionally starts in the January, so a couple of months, and Sunderland are on an FA Cup run, which gathered momentum, and it's quite a famous. What happened went down in history. The 1973 Cup run, and not just the final, the victory against Leeds, who were odds-on favourites and all conquering, but some tremendous matches along the way where they've beaten Malcolm Allison's Manchester City, Arsenal in the semi-final, and then of course Leeds United in the final. So that's cemented. If that had been all he achieved, that would have been more than enough. The problem arose: how do you follow that? And the natural progression is the expectation level was sky high following the 73 win, that promotion was the next thing on the agenda. Now, that wasn't instantly achieved. So we've got the 73-74 season and then the 74-75 season where we finished fourth, so we're just missing out by one place. Now, I mentioned in the book that if there's to be fault found with Stokoe, and Dennis Stewart analyses it, I think, very well in his book, his autobiography, that Stokoe was comfortable dealing with lesser lights, not the big time players who came with, in inverted commas, baggage, or were larger than life personalities who perhaps would try to rule the roost in the dressing room. His man management was more tailored, perhaps, to the players that he brought in on the cup run, for example, Vic Hallam from Luton Town, that was one, and Ron Guthrie. They worked very well. But in translating that into gaining promotion, it was more of a slow burner. But that was achieved in the 75-76 season. Sunderland did finish as champions, and it was mainly on the back of a almost immaculate home record. 119, drawn 2, and they didn't lose a single league match at home. So it was on the back of the home record primarily. and that's really the point where I start to come in on the Fistful of Doldrums, where it started to unravel. But Stoker had he made his mark, and he regarded as a I suppose a legend on Wayside.
How did his undoing come about in the job? How did the end come about for Stoko?
Um, well, what I go into in the book is that the at the tail end of that 75, 76 season, although things were seemed quite rosy, um, we were virtually never out of the top two. Um, we were embarking on a very exciting FA Cup run again, where we'd knocked Stoke City, First Division Stoke City, out in the fifth round stage, and then we got the home draw, which, as I've just outlined, our tremendous home record that season, almost unbeatable. Well, we were unbeatable in the league, and we got drawn against the third division club, Malcolm Allison's Crystal Palace. Now, ironically, that season is currently being shown on the very good big match revisited currently. And the Crystal Palace Cup run, they had taken the scalps away from home of Leeds United and Chelsea. So, whilst by no means was it taken as a formality that Sunderland were going to progress, I think we were all excited that a semi-final, an FA Cup semi-final, was in our grasp again, and especially for perhaps younger children like me, who perhaps weren't quite old enough to appreciate the '73 Cup run and take it
Mm.
all in. This was like our could be our moment to savor the glory and really take it in properly. Um, so it was a bitter blow when we lost that match 1-0 at home, and it's the only blot really on the season. But in the aftermath of that, within within weeks, the very respected, very capable coach Arthur Cox, who was part of the FA Cup backroom staff, and then went on to achieve tremendous things in his own right, so highly rated by the likes of Kevin Keegan that Kevin Keegan would recruit him to bring him back to Newcastle when Keegan was there, to bring him into the England setup when Keegan had his brief spell at the England job. Um, Now, Stoker, unfortunately, this is a lesson I've learned personally by a wise medical person once told me, don't make any big decisions when you're ill.
Mhm.
Stoker that season had been enduring, I think it was partly the pressure that was on. He was under intense pressure to achieve promotion. He was experiencing migraines. He missed he'd missed two or three trips, I think, to away matches primarily, and left the team in charge of Cox um, during the season through illness. And he got it into his head that um, he and Cox were too similar in in the outlook and their dealing with the players. And I think he had a brainstorm, I think, really, and he brought in the rather ebullient, abrasive, no doubt capable, but coach from Manchester City who had won the League Cup that year. They'd beaten Newcastle in the final with Chewett scoring the winner. Their coach was Ian McFarlane. Um, he so really Cox was essentially sacked. He was chivied out of the club. There was no place for him. I think initially a demotion was mooted,
Mm.
which I mean was unacceptable to Cox anyway. So he just had to be let go. Um, and Ian McFarlane came in. Um, Now, I think pretty quickly Stoker realised he had. I mean, even the chairman Keith Collins, which was unusual. It, Sunderland later had a reputation of a lot of boardroom interference, but at this stage, in the early to mid '70s, that was not the case. But Keith Collins actually spoke privately to Bob Stoker, questioning, which is very unusual, a football decision, saying is this wise to release Cox. And also, I think, like I said, feeling the way he did, suffering illness, Stoker also rashly said that promised McFarlane as an incentive to come into the club that he would be given his head and he would have quite a bit of a say in player recruitment and team selection. And I think at the time he was saying this and offering this to McFarlane, Stoker was suffering illness, and it was almost a relief, a burden lifted off his shoulders that he could share the workload. I think later on, a couple of months down the road, when he's recovered slightly and he's not feeling that way at such a low ebb, that he realised he'd blundered and he'd made a commitment to McFarlane, and by this time it's a little too late, and Cox had gone, and the summer came and there was very little player recruitment. In fact, I don't think there was any. Yes, there was no major incoming at all, and really, I think even the supporters knew that the team might not be quite good enough for the top flight. And what if the tremendous home record couldn't stand up in the first division? They're going to be in trouble. So that's where that starts off, and then of course the season gets underway. Stoker said, "We'll give it about a dozen matches." Well, I think the panic buttons. We didn't get off to a disastrous start. We got three draws, but then we're struggling a little bit. But there didn't seem to be any disaster on the horizon. But then I think they're saying the panic buttons seem to be pressed, and I don't know how much McFarlane was coming into play as well. But in September of the new season, what I describe in the book is, in inverted commas, they were seen as panic buys, and they all came within a week. It was very strange. No activity for months and months, and then 4 arrivals within the space of about 2 weeks, and the quality was questionable. We had, I'm not denigrating the players' ability as such, but Jim Holton and Alan Foggan came in from Manchester United, but it was more a case of not so much their pedigree. It was more a case of Holton had been out for the best part of a couple of years with a terrible broken leg. Alan Foggan had been playing in America and had only joined Tommy Doherty's Manchester United a few months earlier. He wasn't really, I would say, first division ready. He'd been over in the North American League. And then came the shock that some of our better players were being sidelined in favour of the incoming players. We had Jim Montgomery, who he was in his 30s, but he was a record Sunderland appearance holder, over 600 appearances, and he was eased out really. They bought Barry Siddle from Bolton Wanderers, and then the biggest one, which was Bob Lee from Leicester City. Apparently, Stoker travelled to Leicester with a view to talk to or to discuss the availability of Frank Worthington, who had a bit of a dust up in the previous couple of weeks at Leicester, because he criticised his teammates and the team's performance, the commitment in an away match. So he was possibly going to be available. So it was almost comical. They went to Leicester. The talk was negotiating for Frank Worthington at about £160,000. And back they come a couple of days later with Bob Lee for touching on £200,000. And it was thought it was this was partly McFarlane was well known in the press to have been praising months ago the attributes of Lee, and he was going overboard about the capability of Bob Lee. Now, this is all very well, but what was possibly unacceptable, and this was a pivotal moment, I think, in the season, was arguably one of our best player in some supporters' eyes, Pop Robson, who had been our top scorer for the past 2 seasons. He made way. It was, well, first of all, he was trying to, Stoker was, I think, ill-advisedly trying to find a place from in midfield, which wasn't utilising the best of Pop Robson up front. And he had to I think, had to justify giving Bob Lee a place, a big signing coming in at the end of September. And really, this was the end of the road. I think 4 players made their debuts, or 3 of them at least, in a home defeat against Aston Villa. And there was 1-0 home defeat against Aston Villa, Everton. And I think it was within 24 hours of the latter one, Stoke had handed in his resignation, and then the manager hunt began. So it was a combination of things. Illness played its part, and I think Stoke possibly, whilst I don't think there's ever been anything written down or an admission made, but I think he was. Would it be too cruel to say he wasn't a first division manager?
Right. Okay. So yeah. With Stokoe gone, everything pointed towards Brian Clough taking over. He was successful, he was local, and he played for the club. And to put it bluntly, why on earth was he not appointed? And how big a sliding doors moment was this for the club? And how is it viewed now by supporters all these years later?
Well, I would say this is the closest, because this is the last time that Clough. This is the time that Clough actually he wanted the job. A couple of approaches were made in years later, when by which stage, even though there was more or less a blank check put in front of him to name his price to come, he had been so knocked by his 2 rejections at Sunderland. The first one had come in 60, I think it was 65. George Hardwick, the then manager, had put him in charge because Clough obviously was forced to retire from his knee injury. He was put in charge of the youth team, and experienced a little bit of a taste of success with the Sunderland youth team, but Hardwick and Clough were edged out of Roker Park within a few weeks, and that was a bitter enough blow for Clough, because essentially he was put on the dole briefly, but a frightening experience, a sobering experience. So when this not the second chance, when this autumn of '76 vacancy came up at Roker Park, he wanted the job, and it is so close, as you say, sliding doors, because it did come down to a 2-horse race where Jimmy Adamson and Brian Clough were turning up at Roker Park for interview in the same week. At this point, this was all very kept quite quiet by today's standards. There was didn't seem to be any press leaks. There was press speculation of the usual runners and riders, and Clough's name would have cropped up in the usual suspects. And at this point, you've got to remember, I think, that it was before he invited Peter Taylor to join him from Brighton. I'd say in the book, his star was at a low ebb. He'd had the bad experiences at Leeds United and Brighton. So He wasn't as big a catch as he did become only 3 or 4 years later. But
Mhm.
it was he'd still achieved so much at Derby County, and it's another one of those agonising moments because again it was two-horse race, two men there for interview, and when in later years you learn certain decisions made in the Roker boardroom that a 5-man vote, and it goes 3-2.
Mhm.
You just like one person. It happened. It happened in 1984 in my this is another book, my previous book on Alan Durbin, when Alan
Mhm.
Durbin was sacked. It went 3-2 against Alan Durbin. And this again was the same. It went 3-2 against Brian Clough. And I think there was a feeling where Clough himself said that when he didn't get the England job, some people thought I was going to come and take over, and they were right. I think that's what the feeling was with a couple of directors at Roker Park. Plus, I was told privately by a former employee in the corridors of Roker Park that Clough did turn up and he'd had a drink.
Mhm.
He was not drunk.
Mhm.
I wouldn't say he was tipsy, but
Yeah.
he'd had a drink. And this uh, emphasised his usual, perhaps what can be perceived as arrogance.
Yeah.
I do think he thought the job was as good as his. This was the attitude that was perceived by a couple of members on the Sunderland board, and it didn't go well.
Yeah.
It didn't sit well with them, and you could just again, it's just one of those things where it's the next five years seem to be dominated at certain periods in Sunderland football's history where to wrong, sorry, they tried to put this wrong right. It was trying
Yes.
to remedy, but it was like that bird had flown.
Yeah.
But,
How was the appointment of Jimmy Adamson received by the Sunderland supporters, and how were performances initially under Adamson?
we were on the crest of a slump, which had started under McFarlane for a couple of games, and I say in the book there wasn't even a dead cat. What you call it. I think in the stock in the city in the stock market there's what's called a dead cat bounce. There wasn't even a dead cat bounce from the Sunderland in terms of form. They went on a 10. They were on a winless streak. It was a 10-game goalless um, drought, and jokes were being made on TV about this, even on variety shows. Um, but there wasn't any animosity towards Adamson, and it wasn't known that he pipped. It wasn't known that he pipped Clough, and it had been so tight. This only came to light years later, um, and he had a very ebullient, almost infectious enthusiasm that he on his TV interviews. If Sunderland were on Match of the Day, he's been saying, as if I'm confident we can, pull the team out of this. I've got £5. I've got £5 on us to stay up, and I'm confident of collecting my money. And he always seemed as if he was laughing and joking, and he was
Mm.
very upbeat. And so initially, the first few weeks, it was more or less a case of he's inherited this situation. It's not really his fault. So he was getting the benefit of the doubt there. Um, the, the rumbles of discontent started to come when the acquisitions were made, when he wanted to put his own mark on the team, and it seemed as if rather than cherry picking the right players to do the right job, it was almost as if he wanted some comforting familiar faces around him. So
Mm.
I mean, Dave Merrington was a valuable addition as his lieutenant, his former lieutenant from Burnley. No qualms there. That's more or less a given, a standard procedure in the game. You bring your management team with you. But some of the players that came in were Colin Waldron, Mick Doherty, Doug Collins, and whilst they didn't come directly from Burnley, they hadn't long been left Burnley. And then even the players he was inquiring about, the bigger names, there was Brian Flynn, Peter Noble, who the Burnley chairman wasn't happy with Adamson and didn't trying to what he perceived as poaching, going back to Burnley and poaching players. There was no way he was going to sell to Sunderland. It just seemed to reach a point of overkill because the commercial manager came in, another coach came in, the chief scout came in, his former Burnley colleagues, and it just seemed as if there was this impression that he wanted familiar faces and things he was comfortable with. A bit like what I outlined before about Stoker wanting players that he was more comfortable dealing with. He didn't want to be dealing with Frank Worthington. He wouldn't have been wanting to deal with Rodney Marsh, for example. But lesser lights, okay. And I think I'm not sure. Yeah, at that point, the questions were being asked and said, what are we going to do? What we're going to see next? Is Sunderland going to be running out of the tunnel in claret and blue? Etc.
So ultimately, Adamson, he couldn't halt the slide towards the second division. How did the 1977 football supporter react to relegation? And also, it seems unlikely in the modern era that a relegated manager would remain in post. What was public opinion on Adamson post relegation?
Well, this is the thing, because as well as the discontent in the sort of in the winter when the terrible run was still going on and the Burnley three recruits came in and they weren't well received because it was just a case of too many. The coach on the coaching staff at the time, Roker Park, who had a lot of dealings with the reserve team, Stan Turnant, ironically also Burnley connections there, but he was already at the club. I think Tony Towers, arguably our star player. He was the current, he'd been capped by England the year before. He was the captain. He was ruled out with injury, and I think Sunderland had nothing to lose, and Turnant was pushing the claims of Kevin Arnott, Sean Elliott, and Gary Rowell, a trio of teenagers, roughly 18, 19 years old. Arnott was a midfielder. Elliott at the time was a midfielder, and Gary Rowell was more an attacking forward, deep lying forward. And they came into the team. There was a remarkable revival. We went on a tremendous score, and we won 4 matches on the trot. We won 4-0, 6-0, 6-1. And got to this point where 2 weeks before the end of the season, we're right in the ruck again. Things are looking almost as if, yes, it would have been a miraculous escape. In fact, the last Saturday of the season, Sunderland were away at Norwich. It was covered by Match of the Day. They were 2-0 down with 10 minutes remaining, and they came back and they got a 2-2 draw. Match of the Day cameras, the players on the pitch, the fans, the travelling fans, just were ecstatic. And the point put us mathematically in such a position that we actually now looked favourites to avoid the drop. And then in the final 7 to 10 days after the official, because at this point, I think people have to appreciate that I think now, I can't remember how many years ago it is, but there was this synchronisation where all the matches must be finished on the same day, on what's called the final day of the season. There couldn't be any outstanding fixtures hanging over where a team knew exactly what they had to achieve.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case then. So we had two or three of our relegation rivals facing with matches to play. Sunderland had finished sorry, I beg your pardon. Sunderland also had one match to play at Goodison Park against Everton, but Manchester United and Liverpool were due to meet in that Saturday's FA Cup final, and they were resting players who weren't quite, who were fit enough to play, but because the cup final was coming on Saturday, they would err on the side of caution. So two of our relegation rivals got to play Manchester United and Liverpool in the days preceding the cup final, and they both won. West Ham made themselves safe, but the killer for me as a young supporter was hearing that Bristol City had beaten Liverpool 2-1 at Ashton Gate, because if Bristol City had not won, it would have been mathematically impossible for Sunderland to be relegated. So they came to the final match. It was a Thursday night. Coventry City were playing Bristol City at Highfield Road. Sunderland were playing at Everton. Sunderland needed a point to be sure. If they lost, it still looked very, very good, because as long as Coventry and Bristol City didn't draw, that was the only combination of results that could send Sunderland down. Sunderland would have to lose, Coventry City and Bristol City would have to draw. So Sunderland did lose at Goodison Park 2-0, but the news filtering through from Highfield Road as the evening was progressing was very favourable. Coventry took a 2-0 lead. But within a minute, Bristol City had pulled one back. And this is where the controversy comes in, because it became very bitter memory on Weakerside with, I think the name of Jimmy Hill was vilified because he was chairman of Coventry, and it was thought he was accused of engineering a situation where there was an excuse made that whereby Coventry City's match had to be, the kickoff was delayed by 5 minutes, arguably
right.
to allow delayed fans to come in. Whereas even reading it in history now, I'm thinking, well, that's no reason to delay the kickoff. Okay,
Yeah.
some fans come in 5 to 10 minutes late after the kickoff. That's not the reason to. So, and also Coventry were innovators in technology relatively for the day, and they had an electronic scoreboard at Highfield Road. So not only was the match running a few minutes after the one at Goodison Park had finished, but the electronic scoreboard enabled the Coventry officials to broadcast the fact that Sunderland had lost. So this was seen not only by the fans but by the players on the pitch. At
Yeah.
this point, a few minutes before the end, Bristol City got their equaliser. It's 2-2. And so for the final 5 or 6 minutes, the referee is powerless. I think the referee says that there's nothing he could do, but he was just a bemused onlooker as the two teams just more or less had a little bit of a kickabout. Saying, I mean, Terry Yorath was on the Coventry team, and his former Leeds United colleague Norman Hunter was on the opposition with Bristol City. And I think at one point, Terry Yorath looked as if he was going to start running across the halfway line with the ball, and he got told in no uncertain terms by Norman Hunter, what you're doing. And I think all the players realised if they just kept things the way they were, an amicable arrangement, they were both going to be safe. And that's the way it panned out. And so that was the only combination. It was a tragedy. So going back to the original point, it was thought that Jimmy Allenson and Sunderland Football Club had been so unlucky. They'd almost pulled off the great escape. He'd given, he'd blooded these young, exciting players who had played with a freedom. The shackles were off. They played with almost without fear, and it was thought that the auspices for the coming season in '77 were very favourable, as if we can bounce straight back.
Yeah.
So that was I suppose, the mood in which we went into the season. There were, even despite, again, there were no big money signings to excite the supporters. Will Frostron was brought in from Arsenal for £40,000, and he was a Sunderland-born local lad, and so that was fair enough. Just boost the strength of the squad, and it was thought we stood in a favourable position to bounce back. So that's how we started off, really.
Mm. What I enjoyed about your book actually was that it didn't just focus on the northeast. It kind of focused on football and the wider landscape in England. And the summer of 1977 was a big one for English football. Don Revie shocked the nation by resigning as England manager. Liverpool shelled out a British record transfer fee to bring Kenny Dalglish to Anfield. And after much pressure and procrastination, the FA finally gave the green light to allow sponsorship on kits, albeit not for televised matches. How did the fan of the mid to late 1970s consume breaking football news? And I suppose, what was better about the way it was consumed then than now, and what's better now than how it was consumed then, if you see my point?
All right, right. Well, to answer your last point first, nothing is better now than
Yeah.
it was. But I would say that, wouldn't I? But the I use I like the expression "less is more."
Mm,
Um, Later on, you think, oh, I would have really, as a young supporter then, I would have really lapped up the coverage in later years. By the time we got to the late '90s and into the 2000s, oh, I'd have loved all this football on the TV, and the programs, and the stuff you can buy in the shops, the magazines, and everything. It would have been, but with realistically, would I? I question that. Would I have done? I think at the time, um, football news was consumed. There was the morning newspaper, there was the local evening newspaper, where any snippets of news, oh, they were hoovered up. You were, it was almost, you were getting transfer news by pigeon post, a message in a bottle.
mm,
Um, it was, yeah, there was no comparison with today, with the internet and all
yeah.
this. Any scrap of speculation was seized. I mean, there was still paper talk. There was transfer rumours. There was transfer speculation. I'm not saying that didn't go on, but it wasn't as wanton.
Yeah.
There was seriously something behind it. There was usually no smoke without fire, and the radio was a bigger thing then. Um, I mean, I could tell you BBC Radio 2 for national sports news, and I used to know, if you were off school, you used to know that, right, 1:45, 2:45, 3:45, sports bulletin, whatever show was on. If it was David Hamilton, if it was Ed Stewart, whoever was on in the afternoon, early evening, that's when you tuned in for the sports news. And you might listen at 2:45, but if you were, like say, if you're off school and you had nothing to do, you would tune in again at 3:45, just on the off chance that there'd been a transfer news between 2:45 and 3:45. I mean, if you were an avid, obsessed with football, which I was,
Mm,
that's the kind of thing you would do. 9:55 p.m. If you were up late, depending on what time you had to go to bed. If you're up late, 9:55 p.m.
Yeah.
Radio 2 Sports Desk, 5 minutes, not just 2 minutes. You got 5 minutes of sport news. Whoa! So that was for, sometimes if there was midweek matches, you had a midweek sports special where you would get second half commentary, and the show would start at 8. The show would start at 8 o'clock. There'd be a roundup, and then at 8:25, the second half commentary would start, because that's another thing. A match would start at 3 o'clock or 7:30. It would go on till 3:45 or 8:15. There would be 10 minutes break. 10 minutes, not all this hoopla that goes on now. And you would know it was going to be 9:10 or 20 to 5 was an expression.
Yeah.
What's so and so going to be saying? What they're going to be saying at 20 to 5, 20 to 5. And you know, if it went beyond that, it was only because they were playing injury time. That was the thing. TV, and again, remember, no video recorders. So if you miss it, that's it. We had Saturday lunchtime, Football Focus. Grandstand used to start at 12:30. Football Focus 12:35. Bob Wilson presenting. I'm talking when I'm reeling all this off. I'm going because you've asked the question for the late 70s. Bob Wilson presenting, and sometimes you couldn't even get double helping, because sometimes On the Ball was the ITV equivalent at Saturday lunchtime. Brian Moore on the ball, and sometimes they clashed. So you'd have to choose one or the other. You couldn't record one, or you couldn't watch one and then another one, or they weren't staggered in times. Then in those days, it was Match of the Day on Saturday night. Usually roughly about the 10:30 to 11:30 mark. And then the following afternoon, usually it was the London area was the big match, and this is where you get all now, the big match revisited. But if you were in your local area, such as, the north, I'll just speak for the northeast, it was called Shoot. So it would 90% of the time, it would be Sunderland, Newcastle or Middlesbrough home match covered on the Saturday afternoon. Occasional, just as a token gesture almost, you get a game from fourth division game from Hartlepool or fourth division game from Darlington, but usually that amounted to a couple of times a season. It was either Sunderland, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, and there was the local evening Saturday edition, a special sports edition of whatever the local paper was, and so Sunderland had the Football Echo. It was pink. It was a pinkish colour. I think Tyneside had a similar publication, and no doubt I've seen on social media archive old editions of people posting pictures of their local version of a certain evening newspaper. So really, this is the way we consumed the football news, and it was pretty thin on the ground. And then we had the magazines, the football magazine. But really, in the late 70s, it was very much, we either had Shoot, which was the glossy colour football magazine, which was approximately 15 pence. There was the odd, but this was more for the people with a lot of pocket money. I very rarely saw this. I think had a Football Monthly, but that was something like which was like 40 pence, which was quite a bit of money then. And from memory, whilst it's not quite in the period covered by my book, but it's still just in the 70s. Match magazine came out, and at the time it was called Match Weekly. They dropped the weekly a few years later in the title, and that was a new and exciting thing for that to come out. There was the occasional things where you'd see adverts on the TV for these the publisher called Marshall Cavendish. Marshall Cavendish used to produce serials on all sorts of subjects. But if they had a football one out, and I make reference to this in the book, Football Handbook, I think was published around about the 78, 79 mark, and that was like 30 pence. And that was it was just new and exciting. We used to latch on to anything like this, any reference to football on the TV, or it was just like it was just. I'm trying to describe it for myself. It was just like gold dust. It was because I was so infatuated with football.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think less is more. I think it's overkill these days. We know that Sunderland was struggling at this time, but how were their northeast adversaries, Newcastle and Middlesbrough, getting on? What was the state of play at these clubs?
Initially, when Sunderland were going down, Newcastle had just qualified for Europe by finishing about, I think it was fifth in the first division. But Gordon Lee, who they spent the vast majority of the past season under, he'd left for, I suppose, what he must have viewed as a bigger job, at taking on the post at Everton. However, saying that, a lot of his thinking may have been affected by the working with a northeast boardroom, because at the time the St James's Park boardroom had a bad reputation for working with manager, and so they appointed an untried Richard Dinnis, who had been the coach, and he'd been popular with the players. But I think over the decades, there's often a case where somebody is appointed on a wave of player popularity, and it doesn't always translate into success. I think we've seen that a few times over the years. And this is one case where the 77-78 season started disastrously for Newcastle. And Dinnis wasn't really able to attract any players to rest the slide. So they had a disastrous season where Newcastle, they got relegated. But that Dinnis didn't last long. He got the famous vote of confidence, I think, on 2 occasions before he eventually left in the autumn, was sacked, and Bill McGarry came in, which I think is fair to say. I don't think you had to be a Newcastle supporter, because listening and reading the local press and listening to local BBC Radio Newcastle and Metro Radio, which were the 2 local radio stations, as a young supporter, you used to imbibe all the news from Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough. You used to absorb it like a sponge. It's still there in my brain. You're familiar with all the other teams, players, their names, their happenings. I think it's fair to say the appointment of Bill McGarry did not excite the imagination there at Newcastle. So he could do nothing about the relegation fate. Middlesbrough had John Neal, who'd just taken over from Jack Charlton. Very different personalities. Jack Charlton, big, bold, almost larger than life character. John Neal, a lot more understated, but with northeast connections. Ironically, more Wearside so, but he'd enjoyed success with at a lower level with Wrexham, and he was he did okay. Middlesbrough had a decent season. Bit of a letdown for them. They got through at the 6th round of the FA Cup and were expected to beat Orient. A bit like Sunderland the previous year, or 2 years before. They had a home match in the 6th round of the FA Cup against unfancied opposition, second division, lowly Orient, who were struggling against relegation in the second, and they were forced to a replay and they got knocked out. So that was a bit of disappointment for Middlesbrough. They were on the cusp of an FA Cup semi-final appearance. But they had a decent season and they still had some quality players, like David Armstrong, and then young players who would make a name for themselves were coming through, like Mark Proctor, Craig Johnston, to a lesser extent David Hodgson. So they had a lot of promise there. And yeah, so Middlesbrough were faring the best of the three, and then so 77-78 season, Newcastle actually would join Sunderland for the following season as second division rivals. So it was so Middlesbrough stood out as being the only first division team where 2 years previously had been what I think they used to call them the big three, which was like Sunderland, Newcastle, Middlesbrough, and they were all in Division One, and now two of them were in Division Two. So, and Sunderland hadn't bounced back and had a very disappointing season.
Yeah. Another great story I read with interest about in your book was that after the 1978 Charity Shield, which Nottingham Forest thrashed Ipswich, I believe, 5-0, neither Brian Clough or Bobby Robson chose to speak to the media after the game, and the press arrangements were simply just cancelled. In the media-driven football world of today, this would be inconceivable. What was the relationship like between clubs and media in the period covered by your book? What did you learn about these relations?
Yeah, I think nowadays it will be in the contract where they would not be allowed. It will be reprimanded and disciplined if they missed a press conference. But yeah, I found it so refreshing. I mean, I know Bobby Robson and Brian Clough missed the press conference for very different reasons.
Mm.
Robson because he was in the hoof, and Clough because he was Brian Clough and he didn't feel like it. I mean, it's wonderful. It's refreshing. Um, but I think the whilst avid for scraps of news, the press wasn't so oppressive, and it wasn't managers weren't having a microphone and a notepad thrust in front of their nose at every given opportunity. I think there were personal relationships established between a couple of journalists, and they would have their favourites. Like a manager would establish where he would maybe give a scoop, or they would talk more to certain journalists, and there would be a reciprocal arrangement where they would not abuse that trust, the journalist. Um, but even going, say, 4 years hence, Alan Durbin spoke about travelling to Roker Park, knowing he was going to see a couple of pressmen there, and he was trying to think, not invent, but
Hmm.
trying to think of what he could, what tidbits he could throw to them. Say like,
Yes.
oh, I've made an inquiry for so and so, or whatever. So even by about 82, it had changed a little bit, but by in the late 70s, it just seems there was a more dignified, respectful um, way of doing things, relatively,
Yeah, yeah.
and compared to more modern times.
I think in the modern era, it seems a lot more of the narrative is curated for the TV and for the constant churn of news, whereas in those days it seemed a lot more sincere. The managers and the press guys, the relationship seemed a lot more personable, and it just seemed a lot more real, if that makes sense. Um,
I
Moving on
thought a lot of
slightly.
the
Oh, sorry, on you
so,
go.
so I thought what struck me was that the education of some of the journalists then and their former and being steeped in the game themselves. There would be people like, I'll just throw two names out because of the Northeast connections. Ivor Broadus, who was a former England international, I think from the 1940s.
Mhm.
He was writing. on a regular basis, and Len Shackleton, who played for Sunderland and Newcastle, England international, he was a press man as well. So there were players who came at it not just, oh, this might be controversial to say, better educated,
Yeah.
more articulate,
Yes.
and but also knowledgeable because they'd been there, done that at a high level.
Hmm. Now, back to Sunderland, after a pretty uninspiring spell as manager, Jimmy Adamson was surprisingly recruited by Leeds to replace Jock Stein. Why did Leeds want him, and how was his departure received by the Sunderland support?
Um, there were no tears shed at Adamson's departure. In fact, there was probably bewilderment at why Leeds, sort of a middling at the time, comfortable first
Hmm.
division club. I mean, this wasn't an act of desperation from Leeds. It wasn't a case of where they had found themselves near the bottom and seen what a remarkable job Jimmy Adamson almost had pulled off 2 years previous and thought, oh, we'll have some of that. It was a case of Leeds were quite comfortable in first division, and they were trying to chase, find again that magic recipe to give them some success again. So it was a strange choice that the boardroom didn't seem as if they were united in the choice. But before the appointment of Jock Stein, Johnny Giles, the former player, had been approached. But then the chairman and another director were outvoted by the rest of the board, who didn't want Giles and felt there was, yeah, there was just something. And even Jock Stein, it didn't seem as if Jock Stein was unanimous,
Mm.
and certainly it wasn't the case with Jimmy Adamson. It's a strange one. Um, I mean, they had gone, Leeds had gone for their first choice, admittedly, was Laurie McMenemy. And
Hmm.
he had thought about it seriously, but then decided against it. Um, so it was one that was, it must have always been a possibility because Adamson's name cropped up in the press very, very soon after Jock Stein took the Scotland job. But it was almost dismissed locally um, as just press talk.
Mm.
It was very surprising, and I don't think even Leeds. I mean, I've watched one or two good YouTube channels which chronicles the Leeds United's history, and
Hmm.
it takes you through that time. And not only it was interesting to read with hindsight of Adamson. Two crucial areas which he'd refused to do when he came to Roker Park were he didn't sign a contract and he did not move um, domestic arrangements to Wearside.
Hmm.
Now, Leeds United, he agreed to do both of those things, which doesn't sit well. It's things, well, why couldn't he have done that at Sunderland? He's not the first, and he's certainly not the last manager. I could name a couple. I mean, I'm not going to badmouth one or two managers since then, but they didn't move and base themselves on Wearside. They wanted the cake and they wanted to eat it. They wanted to retain a home further down south or wherever they come from.
Mm.
But yeah, so Adamson did those two things, and then he started to repeat what arguably the mistakes he'd made at Roker Park, where he started to recruit all the staff that he'd brought to Roker Park, which had been so unpopular at Burnley. And some of the players, whilst now he had a bigger checkbook at his disposal, he was able to sign players that he'd gone for with Sunderland, like Alan Curtis from Swansea City, where he could splash out 400 odd £1,000 for him. He could splash out over £400,000 for Alex Sabella from Sheffield United. But mixed in with those was some really strange way. He went back and he went back to Sunderland and he actually signed. Bob Lee signed on the dotted line for Leeds United, and quite frankly, whilst Lee was not a disaster at Sunderland, and I think he was a wholehearted player, I think Sunderland fans were quite pleased when he seemed to be going to Leeds. He actually signed for Leeds, and then I think the fee was going to be, it was 50, 75,000, around about that mark, and he actually failed the medical. It was a bit of a blow having to come back to Rock Park in a way, because not to be too critical of Bob Lee, it was more a case of he was surplus to requirements, and it was thought, well, that would be another £75,000 towards our next transfer target. So it was a disappointment from that perspective. And then, he took Wayne Entwistle to Leeds United for £80,000. Now, Wayne Entwistle was a good centre forward, but there were strange signings. It just seemed as if there was an air of him again. He'd arrived at Leeds and he wanted a few familiar faces around him.
Yeah. While all this is going on, Sunderland are in their second consecutive season in Division 2. Ambitious moves were made to tempt both Laurie McMenemy and Bobby Robson back to the North East. What does it say about the then Sunderland board that they could not convince either of these successful and again local managers to lead the club? And I suppose, why couldn't they convince them to join?
Well, it certainly wasn't a case of the money, because they'd been prepared when they went back for Clough, and this was after Clough, though. By this point, he'd won the Championship and League Cup in his first season back up with Nottingham Forest, reunited with Peter Taylor. They were embarking on a European Cup campaign, which they, of course, won. Well, and didn't know that at the time, but in the autumn, when they went back to Clough, it was more or less money no object for Brian Clough, and he turned them down this time. He played with them a bit, he made them suffer, he made them sweat, but I think he was just exacting a little bit of retribution for what he perceived as ill treatment in the past. So with Robson and McMenemy, the wages were not a factor. Bobby, they both had strong northeast connections. Bobby Robson was County Durham. Laurie McMenemy was more Tyneside, but he still classed himself as, and he was perceived as northeast. As I say, there wasn't that intense marginalisation of you're either black and white or red and white to such a degree then. So there was that connection, and they were both. I don't think it was just lip service on their part. They were genuinely tempted, because they appreciated the passion, the intense passion, and if they got results, if Laurie McMenemy got the results at Sunderland that he got at Southampton, and if Bobby Robson got the results he was getting at Ipswich, at Sunderland, he knew there would be 40 to 50,000 attendances at Roker Park. And the passion, they both knew the untapped potential, they both knew the passion that existed in the North East hotbed that did not exist in their part where they were at the time. So they were tempted. And I think it was a case of there was a little bit of a comfort factor. Both men worked with clubs that were almost had a family. That word crops up a bit at the time. Portman Road, there was the famous expression, the only crisis they had is when they run out of port in the boardroom. And similarly, Laurie McMenemy had a very good working relationship with the Southampton boardroom. Was more or less given free hand within obvious limits to do as he pleased. And same
Mm.
with Bobby Robson. They were left to get on with the football side, and the boardroom got on with their side. And whilst I say at the time, the Roker Park boardroom did not have the negative reputation that it had acquired only 4 or 5 years after this,
Mm.
and it didn't have the reputation that the St James's Park board seemed to have at the time. So, um, but having said that, I think there would be have been going into an unknown situation from one which was very comfortable. And there was also an element of whether the likes of Clough and Robson and McMenemy were using the Sunderland interest to feather their own nests in respect
Right.
of make their own position better. And like, for example, Brian Clough would say, "Oh, if the Nottingham Forest um, fans can make it a sellout and in the season ticket sales increase, I'll be in great." Like he was saying, you'd be encouraged to stay. Bobby Robson, I think, said something very much along those lines
Mm.
when someone were interested in him, and McMenemy to a lesser extent intimated that if this was replicated at the Dell, then there wouldn't be I wouldn't even be thinking about it, but so there was that there was that element to it as well, and I think Bobby Robson seemed to have the ear of the press. In fact, he seemed as if he went public a little bit too often, as if he had. There was one point where Barcelona were on their manager was in great jeopardy of being sacked. He was on a losing. Well, he was on a at loggerheads, or he was unpopular with somebody in the board. Looked as if he could lose his job. So Bobby Robson seemed to be play, playing all his options.
Mm.
He had this. He more or less, in fact, arguably, well, probably not even arguably, it was wrong of him to come out and say that he had the offer of the Sunderland job to go to in the summer if he wanted it, whilst at the same time half expecting Barcelona to come in. And I mean, what are the Ipswich board? I mean, what was our current caretaker boss, Billy Elliott,
Mm.
who was hoping to get the job permanent at the end of the year, especially at the season, especially if he gained promotion.
Yeah.
What was he to think about Bobby Robson claiming that he'd been given the thumbs up, the job's his at the end of the season if he says yes? And like I say, Barcelona were in from. So there was all this going on. So again, what was the real story? I suppose to some extent you'll never know. But I think it was a combination of they were comfortable in their own position, and they might have had in Robson's case, goodness knows how much money he was going to be offered by Barcelona. Um, so yeah, I can't give a definitive answer, but there was about two or three things in play. Yeah.
Yeah. So as you just mentioned, the coaches Billy Elliott and Ken Knighton overseeing the ultimately unsuccessful promotion bid. What effect did all the speculation over various prospective new managers have on the players and on the attempt at gaining promotion?
There's probably two lines of thought. There's the official dressing room line, which is what you get, I think, from players on a regular basis, and certainly when I've been speaking to, for example, the likes of Gary Rowell about about the period and then the later period under Alan Durban. Um, it's as if, oh, we're the players, we're just interested in going out in being picked for the team, and that's something contracts, speculation over managers. We shut all that out. We're focused on the job on the pitch. So I think that there is that line of thought, and it's not just Gary Rowell saying that. It's other players have been quoted as along similar lines. But then there will be the people who are more directly involved with the management side, likes of Ken Knighton, would would criticise the board, saying how are we? This probably goes on at no other club. How are we supposed to be? We're in the last weeks of a promotion push, and we're having to deal with all this. The players have shown admirable focus on being able to, on they're still doing the job. They're good professionals, but it was obviously affecting Elliot and Knighton. And I mean, when Elliot eventually didn't, well, we missed out on promotion, and Elliot didn't get the job. Well, Ken Knighton was kept dangling. I mean, he was not the only man to say that he'd been left hanging in limbo. This was an expression that came up on more than one occasion. It's in limbo. He didn't know whether he could go ahead with a house move. He didn't know whether he was going to just be kept on as coach, and that's all very well saying the Sunderland board saying, "Oh, your position as first team coach is safe." If they recruited a new manager, the new manager might want his new staff around him, and Ken Knighton might be looking for a new job. So on more than one occasion during the 78-79 season, there's Dave Merrington used this because he took over. He was looking after the Roker for a few weeks, but when Adamson went to Leeds, he had the offer a good contract to go and resume his former relationship with Jimmy Adamson in the similar position at Leeds United, Ellen Road. But he agreed to stay at Sunderland, Roker Park, look after things until they appointed a permanent successor. And then he used the expression, "I'm in limbo. I've got a good job offer to go to." He was eventually he was offered the job on a permanent basis, but it felt as if he was very much not even second choice, because it's after they'd had a host of rejections. So, like I say, there's two lines of thought, but the players certainly would always what they really felt, but that their official line was always they were focused on the job in hand and on matters on the pitch. Certainly when they were, I couldn't. Certainly, Rowell commented when he was younger, when he was a teenager coming into the team, it was all an exciting new adventure, and it didn't matter what was going on upstairs. It was, but when I suppose when a professional is about 28, 29, they're maybe looking at what could potentially be their last major offer of a 3-year contract, or the last relatively lengthy contract of their career before they enter the last period. Whether I think it would affect them more then, but they were always pretty unified in their response about any discussion of do you know what was going on with so and so contract? I said, "Oh, no, that's we're just concentrating on what's going on the pitch."
Yeah. Quite a lot of the time, football books are written about kind of success and glory. What was it about this period that inspired you to write about it, and what sort of journey did writing the book take you on?
I do like to approach what I feel are neglected areas to focus on. Like I felt the Alan Durban reign at Sunderland had been a neglected period. I felt the 77 to 79 period fell into the same category. It's also, from a personal point of view, it takes you back to a younger, what I perceive as a golden age in the life of what's going on culturally, music, TV, everything almost. Okay, there was the bad points. I mean, I am looking at it with rose-tinted spectacles to a degree, but not too much. Um, and the football period there, I thought, well, all these names are still, to use the Shakespearean term, familiar in my mouth as household words. It's
Mm.
all the squad players from other teams. I would not be the only one who could say Liverpool 70, 79, 77, 79, what's a team?
Yeah.
Clements, Neil, Jones, blah, 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 etc. Ipswich Town, Aston Villa. I mean, Ipswich Town, Aston Villa squads of, say, 80, 81, you could, that will vying for the champion, for the first division championship. They were going by with squads for about 14, 15.
Yeah.
I could name now, which I'm not going to, probably virtually the whole Aston Villa squad of 81. Similarly with Ipswich, I could name Liverpool, Manchester United, lots of squads
Yeah.
from 77 to 79. And I think, and my feeling was, well, if I feel like this, there's going to be a lot of other people out there similarly inclined. I know the kind of football books that I personally enjoy reading are more in line with what I'm producing now.
Yeah.
Um, and I just found the era fascinating, and it's partly because it hasn't been covered. It hasn't been. I used the expression before. It's not something that's been done to death. I'm not claiming that just because something is hasn't been covered or makes it worth covering, it
Mm.
could. It, if it's going to be as dull as ditch water, it's going to be as dull as ditch water, no matter what sort of artistic magic you try and work on it.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it's something that does appeal to me. I mean, I never say never, but I'm not going to write about a Sunderland promotion campaign.
Yeah.
I'm not going to regurgitate what I feel has already been well covered by Lance Hardy, who's sadly deceased. I'm not going to write about the FA Cup final of 1973.
Yeah.
He's produced almost a definitive version. Um, so I like to try and find something that has been neglected. I'm bearing in mind my speciality period of let's say let's say 74 let's say 74 to 94 to give a ballpark figure. I'm running out. Well, when, which is I'm not a young man anymore anyway. So it's not as if it's going to be a great loss to literature, football literature. But I'm running out of neglected areas. I haven't exhausted them yet. I'm looking at something now which doesn't fill me with the same zeal or enthusiasm as the last two. But I try and I feel as if I must try and do something constructive. I wrote A Fistful of Doldrums under in a period of personal um, domestic difficulty. I'm an unpaid carer, and I've got this, just and I'm realizing there's a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people who have their own set of problems. So, but personally speaking, I was writing under a fistful of doldrums in a period of almost semi-depression, and it was cathartic. It was almost allowing, almost not quite, almost allowing one to escape um, present day life and be transported back to
Yeah.
this period where in your life and what you perceived as better times and more exciting times. I remember the rereading it, you can conjure almost the excitement that football created for me, particularly between 75 and late 70s, early 80s. It was. I just found it so exciting, and you were, as I say, you were latching on every scrap of football news, and
Yeah.
it was days when a team would have a football strip, and it was a big thing when they changed it. They would have it for 3 or 4 years,
Mm.
and I used to watch Match of the Day on the first day of the season, and there's like, 3 or 4 teams might have changed their kit. Um, I mean, it was just little things like this. They all add up, and I try to capture some of that in the publications, the magazines, the sticker albums. That was just like, it was just new and exciting. It, you know, it was better than computer games. I can't, it's difficult to describe it. But
Yeah.
some people out there know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you did decide to go over these kind of neglected areas because the book was absolutely brilliant. I would recommend it to anyone. And finally, just to wrap things up, where can people buy the book and where can they find out about what you're up to?
Yeah, all the usual outlets, Amazon, Waterstones. Um, it's soccerbooks.co.uk. They they have a very enlightened, what I would call a very enlightened review of the book on the page where you actually can buy the book on the site. Um, I was really pleased to read it. It's somebody who seemed to just appreciate the whole zeitgeist of the period and what I was trying to aim for with the book. They just seemed to just such an enlightened review. Um, so there's the usual outlets, and for the purchase of the book, I do have an Amazon author page. Um, but as far as football books go, it's really the Give Us Tomorrow Now, which focuses on the Alan Derwent reign and this year's publication of Fistful of Doldrums. Um, and really, I suppose I'm old school. I'm old fashioned. I don't have I don't have Instagrams, TikToks, whatever, all this business. So it's pretty old school. So it's old fashioned, but just I would say just the usual outlets.
Well, I'll post when this goes out. I'll post all the links to the books and to your Twitter page and all this kind of thing. Mr. David Snowdon, it's been a privilege and an education. I just want to thank you for your time. I've really enjoyed discussing this with you.
It was nice to speak to somebody who's obviously you've done your research and you're obviously interested in the period and the subject. I can tell you knowledgeable. I already knew that. My conversation with you today has only confirmed that. So thank you.
Thanks, David. Cheers. Take care. Thank you.